A lot of those avenues and language that are used within what I quantify as white feminism have frankly just not been available to Black women specifically.
How do you define white feminism versus feminism?
I define white feminism in the book as an ideology towards achieving gender equality.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Today, we have with us author Koa Beck, who has, before writing White Feminism, her new book, has worked as a journalist at Marie Claire, Jezebel, and other well-known sites, and written about gender topics for many years. Welcome to the show, Koa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you are more than welcome. So let's get right to it, especially in a time where racism and sexism are both so much in the news. Your take in white feminism is that Black women, and you are of African descent, correct? Right?
Correct.
Black women have been systematically not just left out of, but pushed out of the feminist movement. Tell me how that works without going way into, as you do in the book, the history from like before the passage of the 19th Amendment. Tell me how that works today.
Well, in terms of mainstream feminism and the rhetoric that we have used in this country to describe women's rights and also just ascending to gender equality, whether that's making a specific wage or having financial autonomy or being able to support your family in a certain capacity or, be a present and involved, parent, a lot of those avenues and language that are used within what I quantify as white feminism have frankly just not been available to Black women specifically, but a lot of other women of color, Latinas, Native women, as well as a number of queer groups as well. And the way that that ideology often falls apart, one dimension I explore in my book is through labor. A lot of the foundational labor in this country, specifically regarding domestic work and care, that work has facilitated the growing number of women, say, in white collar jobs or leadership positions. But the women who are recruited to take over that labor are not a part of that rhetoric.
So talk about, please, if you would, your experience as a very fair-skinned African American, how that formed who you are, and how that, because you are so fair-skinned, how that formed your view of being African American, and how society looked at you very differently.
Well, about 7 years ago, and I explore this in the book, I wrote a personal essay about passing and passing, not just as a person of color, but also as a queer person too, and how in a lot of white collar, professional settings, especially in which, I am interviewing for a leadership role or, a very specific public facing role or even just a very senior role, I read as a white straight person, and being hyper aware of that in my own negotiations with power or very powerful people, and either having to, at some point, like out myself as both of these identities, or on the other hand, which I explore in the book as well, people being very comfortable saying, racist, derogatory things in front of me because they assume that I am also white or I'm also straight. And it's something that I've explored a lot earlier in my career, but mostly what incentivized me to write that piece is that as a young person, when I went looking for experiences of passing, much of what I found seemed to suggest that this used to happen, therefore implying that it doesn't happen anymore. And so I very intentionally wanted to extend that archive of passing by talking about my own experiences, specifically after, the federal recognition of same-sex marriage, after, well after Jim Crow laws, to show that this happens now, specifically in terms of opportunities, who gets them, and also what power holders are thinking.
Now, tell me, what does it say about society that you internally identify as African American, and yet people see you look very white? So I'm assuming a fairly small percentage of your genes are African American, and yet you're still, in your own mind anyway, deemed to be African American. In other words, why didn't you just choose growing up, since you looked white, to be white, and to act as white, whatever that means in society? Do you have an African American parent who?
I do. I explore this in the book as well, and that one of the responses I got from that essay, 7 years ago was, well, if you're, navigating these spaces and you're benefiting from them, why don't you just essentially ascend to whiteness? Like, why not just be white? And I have with that is that doesn't really challenge power. It doesn't really change the parameters by which we are thinking about opportunity, and also just a basic standard of living. If we're not talking about me and we're talking about, other people in this country, passing to me is indicative of a very specific threshold by which we think about others. And it still aspires to whiteness, which I don't really think is a reinterpretation of power, and I don't really think is progress.
I asked a more specific question, I believe, just slightly. Why is it that society, for someone like you, who seems so white, apparently when you see each other face to face, is still considered African American?
I think that that question is more nuanced, in that when I am in the presence of, say, like very white power holders, yes, they absolutely see me as white. But when I'm, in the company of people of color, whether they're my friends or people I meet, they often come up to me and ask, which one of your parents is Black? So I think it just speaks to fundamental differences in seeing.
Oh, does it also say that to you that being white in today's society is still a much more coveted brand than being Black?
Oh, very much so. I mean, one of the anecdotes I get into in the book is that, no police officer has ever asked me why I'm loitering. I mean, I am not read in that way, again, by power holders. And I'm very aware of that, even when I was much younger.
Do you think, resume-wise, do you think, because companies over the last 10, 20, even I got out of journalism in 75, out of journalism school at Columbia at 75. And I was told several times, if you were African American, we'd hire you in a minute, but we have to diversify. But do you think that still, in some ways, is a benefit? Like as colleges choose, who to accept and who to reject, and they know that they're too white and they have to take more people of color, has it become in any way, and I know you don't explore this in the book, but I'm just asking you, has it become a benefit in a way?
I think that quote unquote diversity as a term should be considered kind of a red flag in a lot of these arguments. One of the avenues I do get into in the book is that I've been in a lot of situations where companies are making what they openly refer to as a quote unquote diversity hire, which is a very one dimensional, I argue, like very flawed way to view candidates, specifically in that they're, in reviewing, say, a department that is entirely white, they realize that that presents an optical quote unquote problem. But the way to fix that is to seek out one person to basically rebrand the visual of the company. So there's no reinterpretation of, say, like the values or metrics that have made your department solidly white, or like why you are only choosing white people to fill those roles.
When you were pitching stories at your various outlets where you work, and very prestigious, very widely read outlets like Jezebel, like Marie Claire, and you coming from not just being a woman of color, but also being LGBTQIA, as you put it. I've heard before LGBTQQ, but I didn't hear the IA. So it was very interesting to see even representing even more groups who have been left out of the conversation. When you leave these groups out of the conversation of being published in major so-called feminist media, what does that do? What's the societal effect there?
Anyone who has been in a newsroom, pitching is a very big part of that environment, and you pitch stories all the time that are not accepted. Even if you're very good, that's just kind of the nature of what it is. And also how stories are selected and curated depends a lot on the quote unquote moment and the news cycle, and a lot of other factors that are important when selecting a coverage for either a day or a week or what have you. But what I analyze in the book is that as a very young person, I started to recognize a specific pattern in terms of my ideas that were chosen and not chosen. So not so much the moment or, what I would deem to be like outside factors, but for women's brands specifically to be constantly exporting this very specific experience. I think it homogenizes the experience of being a woman or a non-binary person in this country by constantly exporting a reality that is really only pertinent to a specific group of people. And as I get into in the book, it reinforces this idea that quote unquote feminist issues or feminist concerns are, really a narrowed set of issues, as opposed to what I get into the book, which I think has more to do with basic standards of living, affordable housing, food security, you know, police reform, like those sorts of things. Whereas for a number of outlets I've worked, quote unquote feminist issues are, um, birth control access, and then finding a long-term partner who is probably cis male and also wants to change diapers with you. And then like the biggest financial concerns are student loan debt, which is a crippling issue in this country. But if we're talking about women in this country who do not go to college, who have to support themselves through an array of other jobs, it distorts, what a quote unquote like feminist issue is.
But there are, as we know, there are more white women on aid to families with dependent children, the current day, what used to be called welfare, then even though African Americans and other minority groups are represented in higher portions among welfare recipients, then their numbers, their actual numbers in the population would call for. There's still more whites on these programs, on these federal assistance programs, than people of color. So what does that make you think about mainstreaming, as you would put it, I believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but sort of mainstreaming, homogenizing these issues in these feminist publications?
White feminism as an ideology and as a practice has a lot of class infused interests. So if you are a working class white woman, in this country who is a single mom or trying, to support your babies by working, say, at like a call center, white feminism is not necessarily concerned with you either. White feminism is very aspirational in its execution, and it always has been.
When you say white feminism, does that mean all feminism in the sense that there are not yet women of color groups large enough to, I would say now, but now is not what now was in the 60s. It's a much smaller, weaker, underfunded organization. It's it's still got a big name, but it's not the power and the presence that it was when it was founded.
That's not how I define white feminism in the book, and my research didn't necessarily pan that out. I define white feminism as an ideology that is very specific in its execution of, say, like achieving gender equality, that relies heavily on exploitation of labor, very individualist accumulation of wealth. It inherits a lot from white supremacy as well, in that these are the ways by which women are told to achieve gender equality, as opposed to many other gender movements and feminist movements led by working class women, disabled women, queer women, women of color, that are much more concerned about the collective rather than the individual ascension as being quote unquote feminist. And I make the argument in my book that white feminism can really be followed and adhered to by anyone, regardless of racial background or sexual identity or class.
How's Kamala Harris's presence in the White House going to affect all this?
A big talking point of white feminism is this assertion that one person, whether it's a woman of color, one trans person, one Native person, will somehow change an entire system. And that has been a very successful talking point within white feminism, and I think keeps a lot of disenfranchised people in very ornamental roles. So I'm very excited for her vice presidency, but I also go into her vice presidency with the understanding that she will operate in a system that consists of constellations of power that are, wildly outside of her own.
I know this is a ridiculous question at this point in time, but I have to ask you, if she were to run for president in 4 years, do you think she could overcome all the obstacles of discrimination and anti-color bias that still exist in American society? And would it be worse for her, for example, than it was for President Obama, because she's a woman?
I think if she were to run again, those dynamics would absolutely exist in her presidency, but in terms of how they would manifest and how they would shape is unclear, especially given that, now there's been so much reconsideration of social media and public platforms and the way people engage in these conversations. So I think there's a lot of dynamics there that remain to be seen.
Tell me, how do you define white feminism versus feminism, and how do we get to the point where there isn't a difference anymore?
I define white feminism in the book as an ideology towards achieving gender equality that draws very heavily from uh, ideas of individual ascension and accumulation of wealth, as well as labor exploitation, and in some ways white supremacy as well, and that exports these ideas and women taking on these qualities as feminism. And for a number of other gendered movements in this country, feminist movements, that has not been the case. I explore a lot of labor movements in this country, as well as movements led by disabled people, Native people, queer people, and their executions and strategies are a lot more invested in collective wins rather than an individual woman, succeeding in a certain capacity so that she can then exploit low wage workers to either maintain that powerful position or get more women into powerful positions. And white feminism generally has not been a critique of the systems of this country and how those systems impact gender on very specific ways, whether it's food insecurity or paid parental leave. Those have not been priorities of that movement. In terms of getting away from white feminism,
you say paid parental leave is not part of the presently existing white feminist movement? I think it is.
Federal paid parental leave has not, in my research, been advocated for within white feminism. Outsourcing labor, and I get into this a lot in the book in terms of a lot of reporting that's out there or advice to feminist identified women in terms of how they should think about their day, but also think about their labor and how they advance individually. And for a number of years now, and specifically post Lean In, the mantra has been to simply quote unquote outsource and not necessarily, advocate with other women in your community to, put pressure on Congress for paid federal parental leave. It's been about hiring low wage workers, generally women of color, to take care of your children so that you can then move into these influential spaces. And the discourse stops there. I think that white feminism specifically has always been, and I get into this, through even the first wave of American feminism, has always been concerned with ascending in this specific system rather than critiquing the system.
Now, your last two chapters are very uplifting because a lot of the book is all about how people of different descriptions have been left out of the movement. But in the end, you talk about how we can close these gaps. Should it all be on white women to draw in and give power to women of color? How do you see it working that we can get closer?
I end the book with laying the responsibility of white feminism at the feet of white feminists. And I think that when at least when I think about white feminism, on a one-to-one level, when I've, met other women and non-binary people, either professionally or, in organizational settings, and analyzing white feminism structurally, what is always missing in those moments is this history that I go into the book and how these dynamics happen now when we talk about, the wage gap or Women's March. It's all this context that is missing. And so I tried to erect this very clean arc by which it is there, and the ways in which white feminism as a practice has harmed so many other women and exploited them, frankly, to ascend to this very sort of, feminist branded utopia. So I think that responsibly, white feminism is the problem of white feminists. And a lot of other women and non-binary people who other movements have been very successful in their endeavors. And in a lot of ways, they don't necessarily need white feminists to come around, quote unquote, to achieve the things that they have wanted to.
Your solution is for everybody to be included in the same movement, but different racial groups have different concerns. For example, immigration. You're much more likely, if you or your parents came from another country, you're much more likely to want open immigration than someone who was born here or whose family has been here for generations and generations. So the issues really do differ. Would it not make more sense for groups of representing different aspects of women's rights to grow and become strong and influential in their own right and have America listen to them rather, or share some of the spotlight with white feminism or become part of that movement? Which would be better?
Well, I think that a lot of the mandates that you're anecdotally referencing, like quote unquote, like don't forget Black women, I think that if you're operating from a white feminist ideology, that's kind of the avenue. And say like Black women's issues or Asian Americans women's issues are always going to be ornamental because from a white feminist practice, they are not centralized, nor are they considered. So what I lay out in the book is that if you change your ideology and your approach to gender equality, then you don't have to operate in these mandates of quote unquote, don't forget Black women, because your foundational understanding of gender, how they experience gender in this country, and what gender oppression looks like is foundational to the way that you're envisioning feminist progress.
All right, thank you so much, Koa Beck, author of the brand new book, White Feminism. Read it, get it, it's out there now. And that's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please go to our PBS website, www.tothecontrary.org. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more. PBS.